As Christians, we hear all the time to trust God. Family, friends, mentors, they'll say, have faith, just trust Him. But what does that even look like? And what does that even mean? You know, that's one of those things where it's really easy to say, oh, trust God. It's easy to trust God when life's clear and struggles are absent from your life. But life isn't always going to be perfect. It's not always going to be sunshine and rainbows. You aren't always going to understand why all the time, or you're not going to understand why everything is happening. There will be moments where our faith is tested. And I want you to search your heart. I want you to find that one thing that you would never want to do. That one thing that you would never want to give up. And what would it look like for you to give that to the Lord? Well, Genesis 22 tells us a story of one man 4,000 years ago who trusted God with the one thing that he would have never dreamed of doing. Genesis 22, 1-3 says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am, he said. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled up his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Abraham, when he was 75 years old, the Lord comes to him in Genesis 12, and he says, I will make a great nation of you. At that point, Abraham had no children. His wife was barren, and for 24 years it goes on, and Abraham and Sarah, they continued to have no children. God had promised Abraham. He had promised Abraham that he shall have a son. Yet, as time goes on, it seems almost impossible for Abraham and Sarah to conceive a child. Well, 25 years after God's initial promise to Abraham, Isaac is born. The Lord was faithful to His promise to Abraham. Well, Isaac was born. Isaac, the son that God had promised to him. Now, the Lord is telling him to go sacrifice him. If I was Abraham, I'd probably be like, what? Sorry, you want me to do what? But Abraham's response wasn't that. Abraham's response was immediate obedience. He didn't even question God. It says, he went. So Abraham rose early in the morning. He went up, he left. First thing. And even before Abraham had heard what God was telling him to do, God calls Abraham. He says, Abraham. And Abraham responds and says, here I am, Lord. Here I am. Abraham was already ready to obey the Lord, his father, before God had even told him what he was going to have him do. Abraham immediately goes. He takes the 3-day journey to where the Lord had called him to. And Genesis 22:5 says, then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. Come again to you. Not just Abraham and Isaac, full-heartedly. Abraham believed in his heart that both of them were going to return together. Well, Hebrews 11:17-19 says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promise was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham surely didn't understand how God was going to redeem the situation. Surely Abraham didn't understand why. But Abraham was a man of true faith. It wasn't weak faith. It was true faith that was marked by his understanding of who God is. He had remembered what God had said to him in Genesis 12, 15, 17, 21. He remembered that God had made this promise to him. He remembered his covenant with the Lord. And being a man of faith that he was, he knows God. He knows that God is faithful to his word. So Abraham and Isaac, they go up the mountain. They carry up the wood and the knife and the fire. And they get to the top, and Abraham builds an altar for the Lord. He lays his son on the altar, and it says in verse 10, "Then Abraham reached out his hand, and he took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.' And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of the place, 'The Lord will provide.' As it said to this day, 'On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided.'" Hand raised in the air, Abraham was ready to sacrifice his own son. And the Lord calls to Abraham, and he says, "Abraham, stop." He says, "Abraham, do not do it." And God stops Abraham from doing what Abraham's heart was already willing to do. We can't fake obedience. God knows our hearts. And the Lord tested Abraham from the willingness of his heart. But what does he say? He says, "Now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son." God knows Abraham's heart here. Abraham wasn't judged off of him going up the mountain or going. He was judged off the willingness of his heart to obey God. He was willing to obey God even though he didn't understand why, right? And then the starting point of our obedience is the fear of the Lord. It's the fear of God to trust in what we cannot understand. You know, oftentimes I found myself falling into this lie that I will only obey when I understand why. And I believe that many of us fall to this very lie. And it's easy to trust when the road is clear. But it's in the moments where we can't see the next step. And it's so hard to just trust and to obey. But truth faith is tested in the obedience of the unknowing servant who trusts in his God over his own understanding. God was the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He has never changed. God's character is the same. Abraham remembered that. Abraham, a man of faith, remembers who God is. Yet now we have to ask ourselves the question, right? In my heart, am I willing to obey God? Am I willing to obey and trust in God to do the things that He calls me to do, even if I don't understand why? Are we willing to be obedient servants like Abraham, who trust in God and remember who God is?